Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today to join this seminar and to address the people in the audience, both in Zoom and on YouTube and other channels. Thanks so much for the opportunity to get feedback on my research. I want to thank Watanabe-san for the very nice introduction, very warm welcome here, and also Sabri-san and Meritaka-san for all of their help in organizing this and the rest of the RIOT team. It's been a pleasure working with everyone in the lead up to this. So this project, it's the first time actually that we presented this version of the project. So I'm really looking forward to getting feedback from Ono-san and from everyone else here. This is joint work, I should say, with Adam Chilton, professor at University of Chicago Law School, and with good friends Kevin Cope and Mila Versteeg, who are professors at the University of Virginia Law School. So. Now, I'm probably not introducing any new information or saying anything new to people when I say that the COVID-19 pandemic caused the largest synchronous, like at one time, suspension of global civil rights in recent history, right? People were told to stay home, people were told to limit travel, people were told what they could and couldn't say by many governments throughout the world. And this is really, really interesting for people that care about human rights and government restrictions on human freedom like I do. And there's been a lot that's been written about, well, COVID-19 in general, COVID-19 and how it's affected political processes, but also specifically about the way that governments reacted to protecting the safety of their citizens by trying to limit and restrict fundamental human liberties. So a lot of working papers exist now. Some have already been published. Despite all that great work by many talented people, some of the most important aspects of the government response to COVID-19 remain fundamentally unknown. So one open question is, did the public support these efforts? The governments around the world went out of their way to try to protect citizens, well, except for in the US, that's a different story. The governments went out of the world, went out of their way to try to protect citizens from the pandemic. And limited many things that citizens can do, but we don't know what the citizens actually thought about it, if they supported that or not. And we don't know what they thought about those government actions when they ran against national law, when they actually violated the Constitution, right? When the government kind of crossed over the line of what it is technically allowed to do. So today, I'm going to show you the results from a large project designed to try to address these open questions. And I think that our results are relevant not only for the political science, economics, sociology, and law literatures we're trying to engage, but also for policy professionals and those who work with the government and think about government interventions more generally. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of the broader relevance at the end of the presentation. So a brief outline here. I'm going to begin with a motivation about why we're studying what we're studying. I'm going to tell you our research design. We don't really have a theory. This is a pretty straightforward empirical question. So I don't really have a theory section here. We'll go right to telling you how we study, what we want to study. Then I'm going to provide you some empirical results from some basic statistical analyses of the data we collected. Then I'm going to, provide you some broad takeaway points in the discussion section, and then pivot kind of to some broader, more general points about what we can learn from projects like this and how other projects like this might be useful when it comes to Japan and public policy concerns. So to begin, motivation. The big question that we had when we were entering into this is, does the Constitution limit the government, right? Most governments of the world have a written constitution, and we think that that actually constrains the actions that the executive and the legislature and the judiciary make in those countries. And we think this because constitutions are fundamentally designed across the world to protect rights, right? A good section of each constitution enumerates in some way the rights that they're providing to their citizens or that they leave protected to the citizens. Fundamentally, though, constitutional limits are a little bit strange because the governments that are constrained by them are also charged with enforcing them. So they're asked to be honest actors in a way and to restrict their own violations of the law because fundamentally there's no supranational force that can kind of restrict governments if they violate their own constitution. So most of the political science and the legal literature on this suggests that the way that constitutions are restrictive to governments, the way that constitutions restrict what a prime minister, a president, a judiciary might do is through and enforcement of the law by public citizens. That the public can get very, very angry when people violate the Constitution, that this puts pressure on the government, and that this basically regulates what actions they engage in, what kind of policy solutions they try to pursue and enact. And the rough thought here is that increased public opposition to constitutional violations fundamentally leads to increased state compliance with the Constitution. So if the public gets angry that the government is violating the Constitution, this is going to lead the government to follow the Constitution more. And this is basically the only way in which the Constitution actually limits or restrains action at all. Now, this is kind of a good, happy story. It means the constitutions under this view are not mere parchment barriers to government action, but they actually contain some bite. They really are regulatory of what the government can do. Unfortunately, we don't know if ordinary citizens will actually punish the government for rights violations. So this little diagram that I showed you suggests that it's only by the public's opposition to constitutional violations that state compliance with the Constitution happens. And we don't actually know under what circumstances, when, how the public will actually oppose constitutional violations. The anecdotal evidence suggests that this rarely happens in practice. And the empirical evidence, the good kind of quantitative statistical studies that have been done on this show real mixed results for the extent to which the public is willing to sanction a government for overstepping the Constitution, for violating national law in the policies that it promotes. And little work has been done on this, particularly in times of emergency like the COVID-19 pandemic. And we think that this is really consequential that that's been ignored, because public supports for rights restrictions should actually be at the highest in the middle of an emergency. The public should realize that the government might need to take extraordinary steps that might even violate the highest law in the land in order to protect public safety. So we're really interested in trying to understand public opposition to constitutional violations in a period of profound emergency. And the COVID-19 pandemic provides us a really opportune backdrop in order to do that. So the big question here is, to what extent does the public support rights restrictions that are unconstitutional? And you might think of this, depending on what walk of life you come from, what kind of occupation, as a more general question of like, to what extent is the public willing to let the government violate law in order to enact policy? And we're also curious about to what degree this support actually varies across countries. Almost all work about the binding power of constitutional law focuses on the US or Canada, and we know very little about how publics throughout the world might respond. We know that America is a very strong constitutional state compared to other countries. Japan, for instance, relative to other countries, has a system in which the judiciary often defers to the executive and typically doesn't deem things to be unconstitutional, even if they arguably are. So we know that there's great variation in this across national contexts, but this hasn't really been explored. So that's what we're interested in here. And we think that these are two really, really big questions. They're consequential questions for a lot of social scientific literatures, and they have broad implications for how we understand the importance of constitutions in public law, public support for human rights, and more broadly, interactions between the public and the state, and how the public actually perceives radical policy actions by the government. So I'm going to take a quick hydrate for a moment. So these are the bundle of questions that we're interested in. And we go about studying this through what we think is a pretty elegant research design. We conduct survey experiments in several different countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we field a set of survey experiments. And I'm happy to talk in Q&A. I know we have a diverse group of people here attending. Not everyone may be familiar with survey experiments. So I'm happy to talk in a little bit more detail about what that means. But essentially, we're giving a survey to everyone that we have in samples across these countries, and we're randomizing a certain component. We're randomizing some information that we provide to people. And it's a kind of a minimal definition of a survey experiment. Happy to talk more, as I said, in Q&A though. So we field these surveys in US, Japan, Israel, South Korea, Taiwan and China. We had ethical IRB review board approval from this at Dartmouth. And if you care about such things, we pre-registered our design, our expectations, and our analytical strategy at the Open Science Foundation, just to make sure that we didn't p-hack or hark our way to the results that we present. So we fielded these surveys with nationally representative samples. In the US, we had 3,012 participants. In Japan, 2,488. Israel, a little more than 2,000. South Korea, 1,400. Taiwan, 800. China, about 2,000. There are various reasons why we have different numbers across these countries. Ideally, we'd have it be the same. There are some implementation difficulties, particularly in Taiwan, where ultimately the Taiwanese government considered our subject to be a little too politically sensitive, and the project was put to a halt. So we didn't quite hit the targets we would have wanted in some of these places in terms of sample recruitment. Happy to talk about that in Q&A. These samples, though, are broadly nationally representative. They were quota-based. We had quotas on age, gender, education, and region throughout these places. And we see that our samples match up on those key characteristics to national populations. So we use a between subjects design. So we fielded one survey to the respondents in each of these countries. In the US, we fielded the survey in the middle of March, and we did that with Lucid, a really growing international survey company of just tremendous quality. And then we fielded the survey in Japan at the end of March with Nikkei Research. Some of you may have done work with them before. Very good people. In Israel, we used the leading survey firm there, Midgum Panel, to recruit survey respondents in the first week of April. In China, South Korea, and Taiwan, we fielded those studies simultaneously at the end of May. And we used Lucid again. Now, we're doing these surveys at different times throughout the calendar year, and also crucially at different periods of the COVID-19 pandemic within each country, right? So in March, by this point in the US, in mid-March, there was a sense that Americans were gonna have to go under a lockdown, but that hadn't happened yet. So a lot of rights restrictions were kind of on the horizon, but hadn't actually been felt. In Japan, this was obviously before Abe's state of emergency declaration on April 8th. And there was a possibility of there being serious restrictions on what people would do in Japan, Tokyo in particular, but those hadn't come to pass yet. In Israel, the government actually had already radically limited human rights in various ways. South Korea, Taiwan, and China were kind of coming off of the first wave from it, and things were easing up there. So wanted to note that just to kind of put all of our results in a temporal context. So our total N here, we recruited a total sample of about 11,600 respondents. This is one of the larger, so far as we know, cross-national studies done about public response to the COVID pandemic. So we're happy about that. Now, there were a lot of things that we did within the surveys, but the primary thing I'm going to be showing you today is this little survey experiment we did. So we told respondents that the government, and we kept this kind of general, so it could be the subnational government, you know, the city government, the national government, was considering several policies aimed at curbing, at preventing, at limiting COVID-19 infections. And these policies would save a random, reasonable number of lives. So we provided actual statistics that we drew from epidemiological forecasts, and we randomized the number that people saw. And we said, you know, if the government adopts this policy, it would save this many lives. And we did this to kind of ground the policy proposals in a real life context, because there's always this trade-off between rights restrictions and saving lives. That's the kind of the fundamental tension in all states. So we did it for realism, and happy to talk more about how we picked these numbers in Q&A. And then after providing these individuals, every individual respondent with a set of 9 different policy options to rate their support on, we asked respondents actually about their support for those policies. So I'm gonna go ahead and go through all 9 of those now. But first I'm gonna go ahead and talk to you about our experimental treatment. So before continuing, before respondents went on to actually rate the proposals, we told them it is worth noting that many legal experts believe that each of these policies may not comply with the country's constitution, by, for instance, violating civil liberties or not providing sufficient due process. So this is an experimental treatment that was randomly assigned to half of the respondents in each of the survey. So in America, we had about 3,000 respondents. So a random group of 1,500 respondents received this additional information about how the proposals that were actually being suggested ran against the Constitution, were unconstitutional, were not actually something that the government legally could do. And this allows us, by doing this kind of a randomized informational treatment, it allows us to determine the effect of reminding people that a law or a set of policies violates the Constitution on their support for those policies. So it allows us to see if people actually get upset when they're told that policies may be unconstitutional, and if they respond differently because of that. All right, so here are the 9 different policies that we presented people with. These are all policies the governments were actively considering as ways of limiting COVID-19 spread. So they're grounded in the real world, and they're taken from news headlines across the globe. So one is prohibit all non-essential movement of people outside of their homes and ban all large gatherings. We're all very familiar with this and have seen this in many places across the world at this point. Another one is to prohibit all people, including blank citizens currently outside the country, from re-entering the country. And I'm sure that many of us are aware of a policy that the Japanese government adopted that was very similar to this, limiting people from coming directly from the US, et cetera, from actually entering. A third was prohibiting all non-citizens except legal permanent residents currently outside the country from entering the country. So the first 3 policies are really dealing with kind of people movement, regulating that in ways that may or may not be unconstitutional. A fourth is suspending all non-essential public or government services, including all primary and secondary schools. The fifth is prohibiting all people from publicly spreading information about the virus that could have adverse health consequences, including downplaying the virus's danger or inducing panic. So this is a free speech violation potentially. Seventh is to take over relevant business and seize useful property, including pharmaceutical companies or spaces typically used for government gatherings. So this is a violation of depending on the country, several different provisions of the Constitution, including illegal search and seizure. The eighth is suspending all religious services or gatherings, including regular church services. So this could be an infringement upon basic religious rights and liberty. And then finally, the ninth policy that we asked people to rate their support for was whether it was about the government requiring some people to work for the government performing healthcare tasks when there are shortages, like assisting in hospitals or distributing medical supplies. So this is kind of a medical version of conscription, similar to forcing people to actually be in the military. Oh, no, I miscounted. So there's one more. The last one is detaining any individuals exhibiting coronavirus-like symptoms and quarantining them in a government facility for at least 2 weeks. So all 9 of these policies that we picked are ones that are taken from the headlines, are ones that are reasonably unconstitutional, according to some reads of the constitutions in each of these countries, and ones that also represent going above and beyond existing medical guidance and advice at the time we fielded the survey in an attempt to curb the pandemic. So according to the best medical guidance that was available from places like the CDC at the time of implementation in March, April, and May, all these things would have been excessive attempts by the government to try to restrict rights in a way to save lives. They weren't strictly speaking necessary. So here you can see a full list of all 9. As a reminder, again, we provided people some information about the pandemic. We told half of those people randomly that we were going to ask them to look at some policies. Well, we told everyone we were going to ask them to look at some policies and rate their support for it, tell us how much they actually supported the government adopting these policies. And we randomly told half the respondents in each country that these policies arguably violated the Constitution. And therefore, presumably implicitly were things that the government should not adopt. So our outcome measure in our statistical analyses is a measure of support for the policy. This ranges from strongly oppose, which we code as 1, to strongly support, which we code as 4. So we have a 4-point scale here. And I'm going to provide you some results. I'm first going to show you some basic descriptive results. And these are going to coarsen the 4-level ordered measure we have of support to a binary one about whether people actually supported the measure or not. So whether they indicated that they somewhat or strongly supported the policy. And I'm going to show you a plot here where on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, you see the different rights that are involved in the different policies that we ask people whether they supported, right? And again, all these policies would infringe upon these rights, right? And then on the y-axis at the very bottom here, you're going to see a legend. Different colors represent different countries that are going to be shown in the plot. And then this red circle that you see is going to be kind of the pooled average from across all 11,000 respondents we have. And then I'm going to show you some plotted points across this horizontal axis, which is the percent of people within a country that actually support these measures. And I'm not sure what your naive expectations are, what you would think about public support for these measures. But the existing literature believe that the public would be unwilling to support measures that strictly run against the Constitution or that are really restrictive of their rights in many cases. And what we found actually is quite the opposite, which is if you look at the distribution of points throughout here, you find that all policies are supported by the majority of respondents. So the majority of people in every country that we surveyed actually believe that their rights should be restricted across these different dimensions in order to battle COVID-19 spread. We find that of the 9 different rights, that something like 7 of them on average are supported by more than 75% of respondents. So there's really strong levels of support for rights restrictions in the face of a pandemic. And we think that's really interesting. So the big takeaway here is the majority of respondents in every country support all rights restrictions. And this really runs counter to a lot of the kind of naive theoretical and practical models we have about public support for human rights always being high, even in the face of disaster. We see here that people in the middle of COVID-19 are willing to sacrifice a lot in order to kind of save and preserve and protect lives. What we also find, though, that's really interesting is that there's a lot of variation in support across countries for specific rights violations. And you see this in the distribution of spread of these points. So for the support for the government taking over business and property and for banning all people from entering the country, you see that support actually ranges from somewhere around 67% all the way up to like 92% for banning all people from the country. So that's a pretty big spread, right? For taking over business and property, you see the support ranges from a little over 50% in the US, a strongly capitalist country. So it makes sense the support for this rights violation might be very low, all the way up to about, 92% in China, which given the Chinese economic model, perhaps it's not surprising that people would be more supportive of government interdicting on private property and seizing it. But there's a lot of variation then across countries and support for these different rights restrictions for some of them. But then for others, like suspending religious services, which is kind of the middle box that I've highlighted there, you can see that support for this policy ranges between 75% and 90%. So it's more tightly clustered. Almost everyone across countries really supports the idea of limiting religious liberty and freedom in the middle of the pandemic in order to save lives. So there's variation across these things, right? And that's kind of the big takeaway from that plot is there's substantial variation across countries in support for certain rights restrictions and thereby kind of by analogy in support for certain rights. All right. So the big question, though, that we kind of began this with is to what extent is the public willing to support restrictions that are unconstitutional? That's what we're fundamentally interested in. Where secondary concern is kind of overall support. So what we want to do to examine this is we want to look at how people that receive this information that policies might be unconstitutional reply and indicate their support for these policies compared to those who didn't receive that additional informational treatment, who might not actually know or understand that the government's policies that we list out could be unconstitutional. And in order to do that, we estimate a series of ordinary least squared regression models. This is a standard statistical model used throughout the social sciences. And we take our measure of support, which is this original 4-point measure of support, and we regress that on a dummy variable for whether or not people received our constitutional law treatment and were told that policies were unconstitutional, along with a set of pre-treatment covariates or measures about broad differences among individuals within our sample. So we include in the model variables for the gender, age, education of the respondent, as well as measures of how much they actually fear COVID-19, getting it personally, and how much they fear people that they know and love getting the virus. So we include these additional measures in there. If you're familiar with statistical models such as OLS and principles of inference, the reason that we're including these additional measures is to just increase precision in our estimates. They should explain some of the variation in our support outcome and allow us to basically have smaller standard errors. All right, so I'm going to provide to you a series of panels across this plot. There are going to be 6 different panels, one for each of the different regions in which we did these studies. And I'm going to show you the coefficient estimate from the OLS model for the constitution treatment. Now, the legend that you see on the bottom left is a legend that you can use to interpret the coefficient estimates that I'm going to show you. The estimates are going to be drawn from 9 different models estimated on data from each of the 6 countries. So I'm going to be showing you a kind of a bird's eye view of 54 different OLS models. And the models are color-coded. The coefficient estimates from the models are color-coded and shape-coded, as you see in the legend down below, across the 9 different policies. So as I said, there are going to be 6 different panels. The first one I'm going to show you on the top left is for Israel. The coefficient estimates, again, as a reminder, as the legend here shows, are going to be for a constitutional treatment. That's what you're going to see across the vertical or y-axis. Along the horizontal or x-axis, you're going to see the estimated treatment effect of the constitutional law treatment. One thing that I should add that I forgot to mention earlier is when we do the regression, we have the original 1 to 4 numeric measure of support, but we wind up actually standardizing this measure. So all of the effect estimates you see from our regressions are going to be in standard deviations of our outcome measure. All right. So for Israel, across the 9 models, here are the coefficient estimates. If telling people that the policies actually violate the Constitution leads to decreased support for the policies and increased opposition thereby to what the government's doing, you should see that we have negatively signed coefficient estimates. And you see this in the case of Israel, we have 7 of the 9 coefficient estimates are negative, 4 of them. So you see plotted points here in 95% confidence interval bars. And for an effect to be statistically significant, we want to see that the bars cross on either side of that 0 line. And what you see in the case of Israel is that 4 of the constitutional treatment, informational treatment that we provide people, the estimate for that is statistically significant in 4 of the 9 models. So in Israel, telling people that these policies might violate the Constitution decreases support for prohibiting the spread of information. So people are much less likely to support restrictions on freedom of speech when you're told that they might violate the law, for taking over business and property, for conscripting people to work, and for detaining people in government facilities. So we see here a reasonable backlash from the public against suggested government policies if they violate the Constitution. But what you see in Israel is kind of how people think people process information about policies being against the Constitution. What you see in other countries is quite different. So the next one that we're going to look at is the results from the US. And here, although it turns out that almost all of the coefficients are negative, virtually all of them are imprecisely estimated, not statistically different from zero, with the exception of prohibiting spread of misinformation and conscripting people to work. And broadly, what you find in the US is that people are largely indifferent to whether you tell them that a policy might violate the Constitution or not. That information does not cause them to indicate a different level of support for government policies. You find in Japan, actually even more exaggerated case of this, where people don't seem to care at all. The effect sizes across these different models are very, very small. They're all imprecisely estimated. It seems in general that telling Japan, which again has a kind of a weak constitution system in the sense that the Constitution doesn't seem to constrain government action a lot. Telling people that policies violate the Japanese Constitution does not decrease support in any measurable way for those policies at all. All right. Now moving to other countries across Asia. So we also did this in South Korea, as I mentioned. In South Korea, we find roughly similar patterns to Japan. In some cases, there's almost a positive effect of telling people that a policy might violate the Constitution, whereby respondents are actually more likely to support those policies. We see that up in the kind of top half of the plot for the policies involving banning people from entering the country, non-citizens from entering the country, and suspending religious services. But all of these are statistically insignificant, right? The 95% confidence intervals overlap the 0 bar. So broadly speaking, the results are very similar, although they may look a little bit different at face to the ones that we actually have in Japan. Now in Taiwan, we see some interesting results. So Taiwan, we had a very small sample size. The Taiwanese government actually interfered with the distribution of the survey at one point. They were concerned about it in affecting individual attitudes toward the government response to COVID-19. So we had to shut down survey sample recruitment at around 800. That means that we don't have as many people that we wanted in our sample pool to really study this and to study it well. We find though, even with this really small sample, there's some evidence that telling people in Taiwan that policies actually violate the Constitution leads to increased support for them. And we have reasons to believe that if we had fielded this with a full sample of 2,000, that the coefficient estimates that we have for banning all people from entering the country, for suspending services, and for prohibiting misspreading of information, that those actually would be statistically significant, so that those confidence interval bars would actually shrink as our sample size increases. So we'd have a little bit of a unexpected backfire effect. We're telling people that something's actually unconstitutional leads to increased mobilization and support for those policies. That's kind of a preview of what we find in China. So in China, this is a very anomalous result and very, very different than what we have from Israel. If you compare the sign of the different coefficients, right? In China, almost all of the coefficient estimates are positive. And we find that in at least 4 cases, they're statistically significant, meaning that if you tell people in China that a civil rights restriction is unconstitutional, that the government is going to violate human rights in a way that is prohibited by national law, by the highest national law, this actually makes people more likely in China to support those policies. And we think that this is a really provocative and interesting finding. We don't have anything in our research design that allows us to determine exactly why this is the case. Our rough theory at this point is that Chinese respondents interpret this to mean that if the policy is unconstitutional, then it must be really, the government must really, really think that this is necessary if they're willing to violate the Constitution. And therefore, because it seems more necessary to do, people are more likely to support it. But this is just a working theory at this point, not something we've empirically tested. So it was a broad question we asked about to what extent is the public willing to support restrictions that are unconstitutional? We find that the answer is really quite a lot. Across these 6 different places, most people seem to be willing to ignore the unconstitutionality of government policy and support it at similar amounts, right? Now, one question you might have is, are some groups more likely to respond to our constitutional treatment than others? Maybe, we don't find anything on average, but maybe some groups, like those who voted for the incumbent government, perceive COVID-19 to pose a greater risk, et cetera. Maybe people that have those kind of attitudes or behaviors are more likely to be responsive to this constitutional treatment that we've provided. But it turns out that when we run a series of interaction models to examine treatment effect heterogeneity, we find absolutely no evidence of this. So there seems to be some sort of universal response to learning about constitutional infringement and how people process this information and how they update or don't update in their support for policies. So this leads me to our discussion. The first takeaway here, the big one, is that the public just broadly supports right restrictions. They're entirely on board with the government curbing rights when they did. And the effective law, in this case, constitutional law, actually seems to vary considerably across countries, right? We have Israel where, telling people that something violates the Constitution leads to decreased support. We have China where telling people that a policy violates the Constitution increases support for that policy. And then we have countries that are kind of in the mix, in the middle, right? With mixed results, or seem to be, in the case of Japan, entirely ambivalent to this information. So we also find evidence that telling people about constitutional law can actually create a backlash effect where they are more likely to support policies. And we see this a little bit in the results that we have from our small sample in Taiwan, but more dramatically from the results that we have from China. And then there's also this idea that the nature of the proposed rights restrictions do indeed matter. So in America, you see that there's a backlash where the public is less likely to support the seizure of property when they're told that it's unconstitutional. But when they're told that other policies are unconstitutional, this doesn't affect them at all, right? So the right that the government's actually violating seems to matter on how people judge the unconstitutionality of it and how they should reply to that information. And then the final takeaway is there seems to be some sort of universal reaction to constitutional law within countries where people with different backgrounds don't seem to respond or process this information differently. And we think that's important too. So some broader points. I know I'm aware whenever I present research like this that in some ways this is abstract, may even be esoteric, and ties into a lot of debates within the intellectual community, but there may be a lot of practitioners that fundamentally just don't understand how this relates to the work that they're doing and why they should care. So I thought about kind of some broader points that might be useful for people who are attending here. And I came up with a few. And these kind of focus specifically on Japan. So there's some open questions here that we don't know. I've spent the last 16 months as a senior data scientist at Tokyo Zaidon, at the Tokyo Foundation. I've been dealing a lot with policy relevant work. And in my experience, one thing I can say that we really don't know is to what extent do Japanese residents support specific government policies, right? We have really, really good data on the extent to which they support the prime minister, to which they support the cabinet, but we have very incomplete data on how much they actually support specific government policies. We know very, very little about that. And I think that there's a lot of work that can be done across many of the different organizations that are represented here today to better understand that and to make sure that policies that the Japanese government adopt and enact are more representative of public preferences. And I think another thing that really is ripe for exploration here is what are the most effective arguments or frames that the government can use to mobilize public support? So we find in our case that if the government provides information that some of the policies it's thinking about might be unconstitutional, this doesn't matter to Japanese citizens at all. But there might be other messaging frames that might actually matter to Japanese. And figuring out a better way of framing policies, of connecting to the population, of generating buy-in, I think is really, really useful. And I'm partially motivated to say this by some of the work that I did do at the Tokyo Foundation about public support for the consumption tax or for increased energy regulations and stuff like that. And you find that the frame that you actually provide, the way that you pitch, the way that you sell certain policy proposals to the public really does matter in Japan. And I think that these are consequential questions to answer, both because a lot of money's riding on our ability to actually figure these things out. And at the end of the day, there are many life and death policy issues in Japan where we probably can bring additional insight, increased efficiency, and better execution for policies aimed at preventing death and saving life. If we think about these things carefully with some of the same kind of empirical tools that I've shown throughout this presentation. I also think too that work like this highlights some future opportunities here. We're in a golden age of social science. There are virtually unprecedented research possibilities that are fueled by new data, statistical approaches, and just better training across the board. And at the end of the day, I think as this presentation kind of shows, we know very little fundamentally about the relationship between citizens and the state. We know very little about human behavior, about political behavior. Almost everything that we knew up until the end of the 90s has been kind of broadly considered to be wrong because of the advent of new statistical approaches and better understanding of how you judge causal relationships. So the doors are wide open for a lot of contributions. And I would encourage anyone who's actually listening on this and who's considering going to grad school and getting good quantitative training, that I think there's a lot of benefits to that. And any organizations that are interested in potentially partnering with researchers to generate effective research for their own purposes that might also be of interest for scholars, I'd encourage them to get in touch. I think there are a lot of great opportunities in Japan. So with that, I thank everyone for their careful attention to this and for the opportunity to share my work. And I'm really curious about what Ono-san has to say about all this and what others in the audience do as well. So thank you again for the opportunity.